David Vizard here, and you guys are watching MotorTech 10. In this episode, that should be 158, what I'm going to do is a pre-test video of Eric Weingartner's Cam Shootout. Now, I'm having to rush through this because unfortunately I had to take last week off with this, that and the other concerns. And what's prompted me to really get on with it was I had a little note on my Google thing down in the corner of the screen, and I started to read it, and I unfortunately pushed the wrong button and obliterated it, but it started off by saying that this test was meaningless, and I thought, how could anybody come to that conclusion? What's going to happen here? What can be learned from it? Well, first off, it's a fun thing to do. Secondly, Eric's investing a lot of his time and money in this so that you guys, including the one that said it's meaningless, can learn something. And you will. Trust me. All of you other guys, you'll see that this guy will learn something, whether he admits it or not. But that's not all. What I wanted to do was to expand on your view of what's being achieved here. First, let me put my position here into perspective. There was a reason why I was the first to sign up, was because I thought this was a let me start again, brain fade, was a great idea simply from the fact that there was lots that we were all going to learn, so long as we set aside maybe prejudices and preconceived notions, which, by the way, if you're viewing any technical deal, you should set aside anyway. I notice that so many people don't. Not good. You are going to not learn something because a prejudice or a preconceived notion may override it. Oh, and the last thing here is forget opinions. That's all they are, is opinions. Data is what counts. If data overrides your opinion, I'm going to ask you to consider which one is likely to be correct. I don't need to answer that. You can answer that for yourself. So all of those trolls out there who have opinions that wildly differ from what is presented here or on Eric's channel or any channel that presents facts. Now, let's get down to something a little more personal here in terms of what we're considering for this cam challenge. The fact that I was first on here should tell you something, or at least point you in the right direction. I was the first to enter. I did this within 15 seconds of Eric announcing that he thought about doing it, and I said, I will enter now. Didn't even know what the rules were then. But why did I enter so fast? Simple. I can't lose. Now you might think, Jesus Christ, this guy's being presumptuous, thinks he can't lose already. No, I cannot lose, and here's why. I'm too old to do these monster cam tests, monster anything tests, without help. Right now, I can't even leave the house for very long for fear of something happening medically. So, the fact that Eric was going to do this test meant that now, suddenly, I've got somebody else can do a cam test for me. Second, I was pretty confident Eric was going to tell it the way it really was. I need somebody like that on my side. So I got to give Eric a thumbs up for that. Next, I've got all of these people, and there is quite a few now. I think Eric said the entries are up to about 16 now, and full. People who I am sure are mostly guys who do well at cam selection. I'm sure some people are just going to have a shot at it because Eric's charging too little to enter. Eric, note. That's why I sent you $200 instead of 100. Eric is charging too little for the entry fee, and all you guys who have entered, do me a favor and send him another $100, because 2 reasons. 1, Eric's charging too little, and 2, whoever wins this deserves a bigger prize than that's currently available. Now, I spoke to Eric a short while ago on this, and he mentions it in his video. The prize money currently available is just shy of $3,000. I know he estimated it $4,000, but that didn't take into account the fees deducted by YouTube and all that. So if you're going to donate, go to his website as if you're going to buy something, right? And donate there, because their credit card only takes 3%. I would like to see it to get to $5,000 minimum. I know we've got time to do it. So that's the next thing. Now, again, am I thinking I'm going to pocket that money because I can't lose? No. I don't know if I'll actually win the cam shootout. I mean, it'd be nice, but I don't think I will. In fact, I would be surprised if I won it, because that means my competition out there isn't as good as I thought. Here's why. I teamed up with Brian Tooley to do a camshaft which was one that was totally saleable by Brian. Oh, and thank you, Brian, for giving me the time to listen to what I thought was needed for this. And so I'm entering this on behalf of Brian, in as much as if we win, it's Brian and I. If we lose, it's because Brian was overridden by my need to use my cam events. So Brian's got some great profiles. We use some Brian knows go for a long life. So we use off-the-shelf profiles that can be used on the street for 100,000 miles. Some of the guys out there are going to do an Engine Masters type cam. Right, if it lasts 10 minutes, fine, that's all it need do. It's got to win a challenge. I'm not going there, guys. And best of luck to anybody who wants to go there. Why? Because I'll learn something from it. Eric is doing a Cam Doctor deal of all the profiles. So we all get to see those profiles. So I will get to see what profiles did what with what cam events and what they read on the dyno. Do you realize how much money that would cost me to do if I was going to do it personally? With the slower speed that I go at and all that, it's at least 10 grand, at least. And the other thing is organizing it. I'm saying 10 grand on, that's just doing the testing part of it, right? All the Cam Doctor stuff. Eric's had to put the time in to actually organize this. I don't have the time to do that. So, just on that aspect alone, I win. I win the results of these cam tests with all the data that is needed to check to see if my cam program actually works. Now, here's what I'm doing. I've got my small block Chevrolet cam program working just fine, but my LS program is still in the development stage. What I'm short of right now is a few constants to put in there for the program to actually calculate the valve event timing and what lift is needed, etc., what vacuum it'll give and all that. That is only the start of it. By the time I finish with that program, it'll have a list of parts that you can get to build the engine you want. So I'm going to have to demonstrate that, how it's going to end up with my Chevy program, which I estimated the constants of an LS engine, put it into the small block Chevy program to calculate the valve events needed. I just want to interrupt what we're doing here for one little reason. I'm trying to do this with every video that I do. I've got a surplus 650 Track Warrior here. It's been on probably about a dozen engines. It's never been anywhere but the dyno. It gets prettied up every time it's used, so except for a few scratches here and there, it looks like brand new. I don't know where it's jetted at the moment. I think the last time we jetted it, it was on a 350 small block that was making about 475 horsepower. That was on a 2-plane intake manifold. It did very well on foot-pounds and very well on horsepower. Basically, I found this carburetor in the range of 650 carburetors is a real runner. It embodies pretty much all of the HP range of carburetors niceties. Okay, it's been used, and the way I'm showing you, the scratches on it don't show as much, but look here, even up close they don't show. It's only when I take close-up pictures of the parts that any use works out. Put this on your car, it'll look brand new. I want $225 for this. The telephone number to call will be as goes by underneath. That telephone number will get you our sales department, but you have to text your details, and a salesperson, and it won't be me, will call you and tell you where to send your check. We're not taking credit cards at the moment because they keep on deducting money. So we're going to take checks. The check will have to clear before we ship it. If you want this carburetor, here's the number going by. So let me show you what we're doing with TorqueMaster in the LS part of it. Here I'm showing you the version I did for comp cams. They turned this down for some inexplicable reason after Scooter told me that I'd really done my homework and this was outstanding. Didn't quite comprehend all that. But here we go anyway. This is where we choose the engine that we need the cam for. In this demo we're going to pick the small block Chevy. But worth noting here is even as far back as a few years ago, a good few years now, I'd already got the small block Ford Windsor style engine done and big block Chevy 24-degree headed engines done. Anyway, hit the enter button and on to the next page. What we are looking for is a hydraulic roller, so we check that box. Moving along once again brings us to this page, which we might describe as the first real business page. This is where we start entering our engine spec. So I'm going to have to zoom in to various parts of it to highlight the entries we make. Please note, the yellow boxes are where we get results when we hit the calculate button. So as we zoom in, we can see all the particulars that needs to be entered, like bore stroke, rod center length, diameters, required peak power RPM. Now I'm going to point out something about the peak power entry here. This is what we are going to target initially, but eventually the program will tell us what we can actually have. We also need to enter the intended rocker ratio. Again, the program will tell us what we need to have. Well, here the new numbers are entered. Not sure the rod length, I put 6.2 there, it's probably about right. Notice I've put in the compression ratio at 11.4, that is correct. We are looking for peak power, say around 7200, and we've entered the intended rocker ratios, which in our case are fixed. At this point, clicking on the calculate data button fills in those yellow boxes with results. In our data entry column, we are shown the cubic inches, 408, and the peak horsepower piston speed, 4,800 feet per minute. Now, that's not just there just to give you a piece of information. You'll see next to that box, there's a little red square. If you click on that, you will be taken to a page which will show you whether or not you're overspeeding the components that you have in the engine's bottom end. That's probably the first of the things you won't find in any other cam program, or certainly not in a cam catalog, and unlikely to be a recommendation from calling a cam company. But as we shall see, that is only the first of many usually unobtainable factors concerning your cam selection. Moving across the page to the other yellow boxes, which are now populated with results, we see some more data that is very rarely, if ever, and mostly if ever, shown in any cam catalogs or any cam programs. So let's start off at the top of the column headed 108. This is the computed lobe centerline angle. It is not a number plucked out of thin air, as you would find in a catalogue. It is the right lobe centerline angle for the data that you've just entered. This number is calculated to within 1 degree. However, it is corrected or rounded off to the point that any error is compensated for, such that the best drag strip time is achieved. So basically this number, for all practical purposes, is as you would find if you spent enough time on a dyno testing cams with lots of different lobe centerline angles for your specific engine, not something generically similar for a generically similar application. This is the fully targeted, on the bullseye result. The next two lines, arrowed, show the suggested 6/1000ths duration figures. Why do I say suggested? You'll see that later on. Why don't I show the 50,000ths figures? Well, you'll see that later on also. We had to have a starting point, and this is it. The next number is the overlap as measured at 6/1000ths. More meaningful, though, is the next number in the column, in this case 2.5. This is the advance calculated for the cam, and 9 times out of 10 it is within 1 degree of being right. On the other hand, intake centerline settings that you're typically given on the cam card are about 8 times out of 10 out by 2 to as much as 5 degrees. That, in my book, is totally unacceptable. 9 times out of 10, those advanced settings on the cam card are nothing but a hopefully inspired guess by the cam company. Next on the list is the intake centerline, which of course is nothing more than the cam advance subtracted from the lobe centerline angle. What the arrows are indicating here is the minimum valve lift recommended. Now, you may or may not be able to achieve this, and that depends very much on what hardware is available. Now for the last item in that column, and this is something I guarantee you will not find from any other published source, computer program or printed text. And that is the vacuum at idle. This will tell you whether you have enough vacuum for your brakes or whatever it is you need vacuum for. Moving across the page once again, the first item in the yellow column is the dynamic compression ratio. That little red rectangle to the right of it, when clicked, will tell you what that needs to be for the fuel octane you have. Moving down to the cylinder cranking compression, we have a figure there that again has a box by it and gives you a target figure. For a good stout street motor on a 10.5:1 compression, this cranking compression, which is of course directly related to the dynamic compression ratio, needs to be between 210 and 220. Moving on down to the third in the list, we have the estimated torque potential. Our test engine here, we're looking at 597 foot-pounds. Ah, yes, that seems like it's pretty high. It does assume you know what you're doing when you're putting the bottom end together in terms of having good piston seal up, low friction, bearing clearances right, etc., etc. Also, going one down from that, we have the estimated peak power potential, 727 horsepower. Now again, that might seem like it's high, but let me tell you, the engines I'm building come really close to these figures. And by the way, they are very accurate. They're usually within plus or minus 10 of what they should be. Down to the next line, we have the required minimum CFM port flow, 356 CFM. Well, we are going to be hard pushed to find a cylinder head of 23 degrees that flows that much. So there's the first thing our program's telling us. What we need for cylinder heads is almost unobtainable. 356 CFM from a 23 degree head is on, but you better have pro stock quality stuff. Going down to the next line, that is the port volume required. This is, again for a small block Chevy, is the port volume you will need to get the right port energy and port speeds in there for a typical cylinder head. Now, something I would like to point out here is that most TPI induction systems are not used to their best simply because the cam selected so often works in an RPM range too far removed from what the induction length works in. So if we go down to the line marked induction length in inches, we see we can enter the induction length that our engine has and select from the line below the second, third or fourth wave reflection, and then it will come up with the RPM at which it will produce peak horsepower and the RPM at which it will produce peak torque. As you can see in this instance, the induction length is too short to produce peak power at the RPM we've set the cam to produce peak power. Just to demonstrate the function, let's try adding to our intake length and see how it affects things. So here we go with 10.5 inches. And that's dropped the RPM at which it will tune to 7,000 and rounding off 50 RPM for the peak power. And again rounding off 5,500 for the peak torque. The easiest thing would be to change the camshaft spec to match the induction length that you've got. Changing a camshaft spec will cost you nothing. On the other hand, changing the induction length is a pretty monumental job and could cost you $1,000, maybe as much as $2,000 if you had to have a custom manifold made. So essentially what we have here is a means of picking the cam to match what we already have on our engine. Remember, the best engines are those that run like an orchestra, not a bunch of good parts that are mismatched. The last two things on this first page worth mentioning are these two lines here. This one is a line with 4 entities in it which you pick to best match the preference of what you want to focus on as for the results. Now this yellow line here where it says select appropriate application is your last step on this particular page, but certainly not the last step in our selection. In this line you select your application, and what this does is it allows the program to focus down onto more of what you want rather than anything else. It will tell you whether you've got enough compression or not enough compression, how much you can rev the engine to, etc., whether you'll have too little or too much or excessive vacuum, too much cranking compression, too much static compression ratio, etc. Lots of things it will say, hey buddy, this is not going to be quite right for your application. So at this point we're starting to trim what the camshaft is going to do. To initiate that process, we go across the page and hit the Calculate Data button. From there, we go, and this is the last step on this page, to the Update Excel button adjacent to it. Now what this does is it takes us to, now wait for this, it takes us to 385 comp cams hydraulic roller profiles from which we can make a selection. Now this selection just happens to be comp cams profiles. They didn't go for the program when I showed them the program, although Scooter said, "My goodness, David, you certainly have done your homework." Bottom line, although it had very high approval, it didn't put that 20 years plus of work into any form of substance that could populate my bank balance. In this particular instance, when I get round to doing or finalizing the LS program, it will be populated by Brian Tooley profiles. So that's what to expect if you get to use the program for your LS engine. And how do we get to use the program? Well, we'll talk about that later. It'll be a lot easier than you think. The program will calculate what your optimum cam spec is. Now, that doesn't mean that you can get that cam. This is telling you what your engine needs. What we need to do now is to get a bunch of cam profiles on hand and see which is the closest. We do that by pressing the Update XL button. And this, in this particular instance, takes us to 385 comp cams profiles from which we can choose. Now you're thinking, my God, how long is it going to take to go through 380 profiles? And when I've done that, how do I know I've got the right one? Well, just wait for this. I'll show you how you can do it all in under 30 seconds. What a great time saver that is for somebody selling cams. Not only can they sell the right cam over the phone, but they can tell the customer what they need, absolutely down to the profile number. Here's how it's done. Yes, we really do have 385 hydraulic roller cam profiles from comp cams from which you can choose. That's a bigger library than you'll be able to find in a month of Sundays. But sourcing cams isn't the only thing this program does for you. It just doesn't find the best cam for what you've got. It finds the best cam for what you've got or what you could buy. So you could optimize a whole engine, not just a camshaft. In fact, I think it would be fair to say that this section here has a more extensive library than even Summit Racing, at least in terms of parts that work. What you see here is the input data and the results from the first page. This is so you have easy access to them without having to go back a page. Moving down on this page, we get to an area where it's actually starting to deliver us data. So let's go and see what that offers us. The first couple of columns are just part numbers. We can ignore those at this stage, but when we get to the arrowed column, that's where we start homing in on our profile to meet the application requirements. Now let me put you on hold for a moment. I need to remind you at this point that this column is 385 lines deep. What we're attempting to do here is to narrow down our choice, and our most general requirement is that the cam be a street strip cam. In our case, we could say it also could be a mild race cam, but we'll go with the street strip cam spec. Although it need not be, the box arrowed is the first one we're going to check. We're going to go through this demonstration here from first to last in some kind of chronological order. However, the program is such that you can start at many different points to home in on the cam that you're looking for, depending what order your priorities are in. So remember that. I'm just picking almost at random a starting point. When you click that arrowed button, this chart comes up. Now let me just home in on the contents of that. These buttons are essentially on-off buttons. So if we hit the select all button, we will deselect all of the parameters listed below. At that point, we can check the street strip box and hit the OK button. This action to select every profile labeled as a street strip profile from the 385 selection possibilities we have. There's just shy of about 200 profiles that fall into the street strip category, so we've narrowed it down from 385. Now let's move along to the single pattern or dual pattern column. In the same manner, we can select single or dual pattern cams. Here we want dual pattern. We now have our cam selection down to 90 options, which are street strip and dual pattern. Now let's move on to the next stage, the lobe centerline angle. Our possible selections range from 104 to 110. We're going to select 108, which leaves us just 13 profiles from which to make a choice. Sure is getting narrowed down here. What we are now left with is all the cams that are street strip profiles on a dual pattern setup with a lobe center line of 108 degrees. That has narrowed our 385 profiles down to just 13 profiles. So far, so good. Now let's look at the overlap. The program calls for 82 degrees, so let's pick an 82 degree overlap cam out of those we've got going here. Clicking the overlap button takes us to this here, where we select 82 degrees. And clicking the OK button brings us to this stage. See that there is only one cam that fits the street strip, dual pattern, 108 degree lobe centerline angle, 82 degree overlap criteria. So in a matter of seconds, we've selected the right cam, but there's a lot more to see than just that. So let's go across the page and look at what we've defined and what we could do to refine our selection even more. Stay tuned. There'll be stuff here you have not seen before. Okay, here's the 82 degrees of overlap, so you can see how much I've moved across the page. Right next to it, we see the intake duration at 6 thousandths. That's 296. That's exactly what the program called for, and that number would be only that number because we've put in the overlap and the lobe center line angle, and we can only come up with that number. Moving across the page, we see that we have an intake duration at 50 of 246, 168 at 200, and the intake minor intensity is 50 and the intake major intensity is 78. Now when we move across the page one more step, we're going to come up with something that you never see in cam catalogs, and that would be the lobe area in inch degrees. Now from this we can establish the aggression index. That's another factor you won't find in any catalog, and that is a measure of how aggressive the cam is. This particular one is 108.2. Now that's a middle of the road deal. Cams can vary from about 90 for a mild flat tappet cam to about 128 to 130 for a pro stock cam. So at about 108 to 109 we have a camshaft or cam profiles which should last on the street semi-indefinitely. Moving along across the page, we have here the remaining factors regarding the exhaust. The next relevant output are the valve lift figures for the intake and exhaust. Following that are the rocker ratios and the valve lifts that produces. Now let's move up here to the figures circled. And you will see that the required valve lift is a lot more than is actually delivered. This is a sign that we need to fix something with our selection. But let's move on across the page and look at lifter selection. The two arrows pointing down show the part numbers and their weights. In the notes box, what we see there are some recommendations about the type of hydraulic lifter we should use. And here finally is the last section of figures and facts we need to take note of. As you can see, this gives you springs, spring forces involved, RPMs, and the cam series number. The bigger the number that is, the more aggressive the cam. Earlier on, I said we didn't have to use the starting point that we did, and that was a street strip or a race profile or a street profile. We can start from almost anywhere. Now let's say we change the cam we want to use here. We've got a big inch engine and we don't want to rev it too much. It's expensive, but we do want to give it the maximum breathing it can get within the RPM range selected. Now, if we select a lower RPM range, we can use a slightly more aggressive cam because the stresses and strains are less at lower RPM. So let's go ahead and change some of the parameters here. First, 6,500 RPM instead of 7,200. A compression of 10.5 to 1. Assuming we are able to do so, let's go ahead and change the induction length so that it matches the RPM that we want peak power at. Here, that means stepping it up from 10.5 inches total length to 11.5. And that results in a 6,500 RPM peak power and about 5,000 RPM for peak torque. Just where we'd like to be for a hot street motor. Starting top to bottom of our output boxes, we see that the lobe centerline angle required has changed to 107. Our cam also is now a 287-291 at 6 thousandths lift and only has 75 degrees of overlap, which is pretty normal for a hot street cam. Our recommended minimum intake lift is now only 700 and our exhaust lift 679. The program is also indicating we've picked up just over an inch of vacuum at idle, so that's good. All are more streetable. But now the question is, does it make enough torque and horsepower with this cam? So let's just check that out. What we see here are some pretty stout numbers. Torque comes out a little over 1.4 foot-pounds per cubic inch. That is very good for a 10.5 to 1 compression. 636 horsepower is a pretty stout number as well. Now, this does assume that you build the engine right, and that means you've got to take note of the next two boxes below that. Required minimum CFM head port flow, 319 CFM, at the valve lift you're going to use. Target intake port CC's 224. Stick to something near this number and that will give you the right port speeds to get good torque and good horsepower. We now have enough data to go on to the next page and look at profiles and their characteristics to select which might work best with what we've got here. So let's slip over to that page and take a look at where we are. When we hit the Update Excel button on the previous page, it brings us to this page. And moving down, we see that we have the single and dual pattern columns squarely in our sights. So let's focus in on those. Come what may, we know we're going to have a dual pattern camshaft. And likewise, 107 lobe centerline angle. As per our cam calculations, these two parameters are fixed. Moving over to duration, we deselect the numbers and then click on the ones we want. Now, 287 degrees was what the program called for. There isn't one there. But what we're going to do here is play safe. We're going to look at everything about 5 degrees before what is called for to about 5 degrees after. Doing that leaves us with this selection here. Now normally at this stage we try and see what profiles were the closest to what we needed, along with being as aggressive as possible. That would normally take us to look at the 50 and 200 figures and make our best guess. Our best informed guess, yes, but let's look at something a little more accurate. Essentially, we're looking for something that's got 75 degrees of overlap and 287 degrees of intake duration. Just for this demo, I've highlighted the two most likely candidates here in the yellow bars that go across. You'll notice that we've got 288 and 285 degrees of duration. Now, if we go to the intake duration at 200 thousandths, we see that in spite of being very close to what our program called for, they have not the best, but amongst the best duration figures at 200 thousandths. That means there's more area there in the opening. But we still can get a better view of what's going on. So let's move across to our area and aggression columns. What this column's telling us is that one of the cams we've chosen, the one just shy of the bottom, has the second highest lobe area and the highest aggression index of our selection so far. If this cam has sufficiently high lift, then this could be the one we want. It has the advantage of being 1 degree less on overlap, 2 degrees less on intake duration, and yet still has more opening area. Could be this is our torquier cam. Let's check out the lift. Well, here's what our program calculates we need, but we're not quite getting there. Go down the list and you will see the exhaust is very close at 672 thousandths lift, but the intake is 35 thousandths less than it needs to be. Now, we could just leave it at that. It would still perform very well, but let's do what the program says and see if we can approach that 0.7 figure. To do this, let's see what will happen if we went up to a 1.8 ratio, which, by the way, you can get for a small block Chevy, so that's not an issue. So let's do that. That means zooming across the page to this spot here. At this point, we clear the box of 1.7 and enter 1.8. Then we hit the enter button and a new set of calculations are done. So we see the intake rocker column is repopulated with 1.8. We want 700 lift. We've got 704. Now, let me say, not even Cam WizKid Billy flat out brilliant Godbolt can do it that fast, I think. Before we wrap up this section, let's take a break for a moment and consider exactly what we've achieved so far. To do this, I've isolated our selection and highlighted it in green, as you see here. The first column is the part number. The second column denotes which type of block it's going to go in, a pre-87 or a post-87. Then we have the type of cam, the pattern style of the cam, the lobe centerline angle, the overlap, the intake duration at 6, the intake duration at 50 and 200, the minor intensity, the major intensity, the lobe area, and the aggression index. Then we move on to the exhaust with all the same parameters being calculated. Next we get to the calculated cam advance, 2.5 degrees, the required intake center line to achieve that 2.5 degrees. The intake lobe lift, The exhaust lobe lift. The rocker ratio we've now selected, adjusted to give the required lift. The exhaust rocker ratio. Our intake lift, our exhaust lift, a selection of roller lifters to use, profile series number, spring poundage on the seat, spring poundage over the nose, and a little note on its suitability for this, that, or the other. So there you go. A pretty good package. And if we were renting this out with just this for $25 for 2 weeks, it would be more than enough to justify the expense. But believe you me, it doesn't stop there. So let me just give you hopefully a brief idea of where we're going with this. Clicking that head title brings us to this page here, which is a giant cylinder head selection program with something in the region of 120 different cylinder heads that you could buy for a small block Chevy. Up here we see that the requirement for our engine has already been posted into the boxes up top, so you have a reference. Now what we've got to do is try and see what the closest cylinder heads are to that spec. So here we go. There's little doubt that one of the most important parameters of the cylinder heads for us to make the power we're targeting is the airflow. So the program calls for a minimum of 319. So let's first eliminate all those cylinder heads that don't flow at or around 319. Now I'm giving it something of a window here because we've also got to try and match port CCs. So let's pick something from, say, 310-ish to whatever's the peak. So here we go. This is what we get. Well, we've narrowed the list of cylinder heads possible down to 24. We can't quite make our peak 319 CFM because the highest flowing one on that list is 317, but that's close enough. The next factor we have to consider here is the port CCs. As you can see, we have quite a range of port volumes that meet more or less our flow requirements. The closest it looks like we can get here is 227 cc's. So let's go ahead and select that. As you can see, it doesn't take very long to go through the selection procedure. Next item on the agenda is the chamber volume. We've got 3 sizes available to us. I'm going to suggest we need a 65 cc chamber. So we go ahead and select that through the same procedure. That brings us to all 65 cc chamber volumes. Now then, let's see what's next. We can have different exhaust ports. Let's say we're going to have a stock one. Bring it. Now we have only 2 choices here. As it happens, both of these choices will fit our needs. So what do? We just pick the one that's the least expensive. If you're a serious engine builder, this page of rocker data will be a very valuable addition to your engine building capabilities. It is, as far as I know, the only published data on rockers that gives not only the ratio that is printed on the box, but also the real world rocker ratios at the instant they lift, at TDC, and at full lift. All of these factors are very important. For instance, if you're building a big inch engine, it is going to be phenomenally short of airflow no matter what you do. So selecting a rocker which is fast off the seat is a very good way to cut down or alleviate the problem of valves which are too small. But let's quickly go through and see what we've got here, and you'll see how far out the real rocker ratios are compared with what is printed on the box. I've selected this 1.72 ratio rocker, as it epitomizes what I'm trying to put over here. Although it's 1.72 advertised, let's take a look and see exactly what it actually delivers at the instantaneous ratio, the ratio at TDC, and the ratio at full lift is either close to or over 1.8 across the board. Basically a whole ratio higher than advertised. Now, is this good or is it bad? Well, it's good if this is what your engine needs, and it's pointless if it doesn't. A chart like this is the only way you will find out. Other than the rocker selection program we see here, we can select springs, lifters, push rods, intake manifolds, and I'm going to pause at this because there's good stuff on here you need to see. Way back on the cam sheet, the estimated power was 660 horsepower. Well, here what we see is an estimate based on what we've selected so far, and we are probably going to be in the realms of a single plane manifold. So you can see that our limits that it's recommending here, top and bottom, is for nothing more than 647 at the maximum. So we will select a manifold based on that power figure. So let's go ahead and do that, and we will select, just to make sure we've got a good coverage, from 505 to 647. That brings us to an unbelievably long lift, so let's just zero it in on 647. That brings us to this list here. Now, you can see right at the beginning there's a lot of part numbers for this manifold. Bit confusing, but nonetheless that's covered. At the other end of that chart are what they are and what the finish is, which should get you what you want. Next page along is the carb selection page. Here at the point indicated you will enter 2 for a dual plane and 1 for a single plane. If we slide across the page, we see the same procedure used for the spacer used, either a 1 or a 2 as indicated by the nearby instructions. Here we will also see the CFM that's required of the carburetor up to this point of our selection. With the selection of a number 2 type spacer, we see the program is calling for a carburetor of 862 CFM. So let's go and select the nearest to that. So the selection process has brought us to this page here. You'll see we have 3 options here. We'll just look through the notes at the end of the lines here, and you should be able to determine precisely what's needed. Now, this may all look like good stuff, but we are by no means done yet. We can select pistons, rings, rods, crankshafts, crank bearings, cam bearings, oil pans, and so forth. This program currently is almost at the stage where a 10-year-old with an IQ of 100 can spec out an engine just as well, if not better, than an experienced engine builder. What I want to do here is give you a quick rundown on what the TorqueMaster program that you will be renting will currently deliver. It will give you all the cam timing, events, etc., and the data for the first pages of input. In other words, when you go to page 1 and you put all the bore stroke, etc. in for the cam, it will give you all that data. It will give you the profiles that you need for it. I am still working on the big block Chevy and the small block Ford cylinder head selection. Also, I have not got the rockers done for the small block Chevrolet and the big block Chevrolet, but they are done for the Ford. That's what you saw here. After that, there's still a lot of work to do. It's all very painstaking, and it's just a question of entering the data. But at this point in time, you will be able to put in the particulars for your engine and develop the event timing and then select the profiles right down to optimizing them as far as the area and aggression are concerned. So that will get you a cam which is on the money, and that's hard to do from a cam company. So you either spend $25 here and get it right first time, or you don't spend $25 and get it right maybe on 5% of the occasions you buy a cam. It's up to you. It's your choice. Remember, it costs no more to grind a cam wrong than it does right. And here's the thing, you're not really buying a camshaft. What you are doing is buying torque and horsepower by means of a cam change. Remember, if you spend money and it doesn't make the power and torque, you've just wasted that money. Well, that brings us to the end of our little escapade here. Hopefully, I've demonstrated the value of this program. If somebody was to take this up, and it'd have to be somebody smart enough to realize that if they had this program, they could rule not only the cam industry, but also the marketplace in stuff that actually works. Now remember, there's a lot of speed shops will sell you stuff because you ask for it. It doesn't mean it works. This program is only going to allow whoever uses it to buy stuff that works. There's a lot of BS out there on what works and what doesn't, and I've spent a lifetime trying to sort one out from the other. Hopefully that part of my life's endeavors has been appreciated. I've turned down lots of big money just so that you could get the truth and not some PR man's dream of what it should be so he can sell a lot and go up this ladder in his company.